Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is not important because this is the fourth time I've tried to record this. Today's podcast sponsor is also bravery. When I think about bravery, I think about myself because before I sat down to record this, I saw a spider and I don't know where it went. So, interesting first round. Landscape of the tournament has changed a little bit. Just going to run through the Wednesday matches first. I'm going to go day by day, I think. That way I can get things up a little earlier. So I'll post Thursday tomorrow afternoon. Sinner didn't even see his name go up on the scoreboard, honestly. He was out of that match very quickly. Kopriva doesn't really have weapons to hurt him. So Popyrin's more interesting. A close match against Ruusuvuori is not really what you're looking for if you think Popyrin's going to pull an upset. I talked on Reddit a bit with someone who thought Popyrin had a decent chance. They pointed out, that Popyrin has good results against top players. And I think a lot of that is, he can kind of punch his way to overtime. If he serves well on the big points, if he hits a good forehand, if he serves volleys at the right time, he can get there against top players, right? He has good results against Medvedev, Rublev, Zverev, Rune. These are excellent results. I just think Sinner is in another tier at this point. I think Popyrin's becoming consistent. He used to play well maybe 2 weeks a year. Now he's playing well 4 or 5 weeks a year. No one can play well all the time in that offensive style unless they're already challenging for majors. I just think Sinner is the best returner on tour, and it sets him apart from the guys that I mentioned. It gives him an aspect similar to Djokovic. Guys in good form with decent weapons play Novak, and once the match gets 5 or 6 games in, it starts to look just impossible for them to get an easy hold. And even if they get a break, it seems like a big momentum shift, and then the next game is difficult. They're at 30 all of a sudden. If they're at love 30, they basically gave the break back. And I think Sinner, like Djokovic, has an ability to get a read on people's serves as time goes, and the match just gets tougher and tougher. And while that's happening, you're getting a little bit more fatigued physically and mentally. There are a lot of players on tour who can play a perfect first set. Casper Ruud's one of them. He'll make every right choice in a first set, and then the tennis starts from there. So I think Sinner also is able to drive returns down the center of the court. And, that's going to wear Popyrin down because he's never really going to score with his backhand from there. His backhand is a bit generic. He's looking to put the ball in play cross court most of the time. I don't think he can really hurt Sinner with his backhand unless he's well inside the baseline. So it gives kind of a safe haven target, to Sinner. For me, I've kind of moved Sinner into a tier similar to the old big three. Where I think there needs to be just some external circumstances for him to lose. An injury, a surface with inexact bounces, something like clay or grass, or an opponent who has tremendous defense, and something that's a big weapon. Exceptional serving or shot making. Someone like Shapo might have a better chance than Popyrin. Ready to eat these words. Tomorrow if Popyrin shows up and plays great, Sinner can have, I guess, some lapses, but I don't really see a path to victory for him at this juncture. Obviously Popyrin's made big improvements physically. So it's the first big test, first big look at Sinner's fitness, I guess. It's just hard for me to see. It's hard for me to see Sinner having to alter his game also in this one. I think he can hit it with his normal pace without big risk, and I think that's a pace most offensive players can't trade at for a whole match. So they tend to try to create. They tend to feel pressure that Sinner's not feeling. And for Sinner, then he can pick and choose when to infuse pace. It's kind of the same thing Djokovic did very well. You play on purpose at slightly less than your full speed when you're hitting ground strokes. And then when you add a little extra, take a little off, it's hard for your opponent to deal with, because as much as there's tennis in this, there's a bit of table tennis to it too. There's a bit of cat and mouse to the game. So I think Sinner wins that in 3. Popyrin should win a bunch of games. If he steals a set, that'll be a good win for him, I think. Royer with a decent surprise given Boo's week last week. Overall, I think Royer had a decent chance if you exclude this month's results, but that's hard to do, So a surprise loss for Boo. He's had a bunch of these this season. It's hard to really gauge, what's wrong when he loses as opposed to when he goes on a good run. It's just hard to win without a huge serve though on tour, and he is sort of a funky baseliner. Royer has a decent serve. The French players are very, very complete on offense, so if you're having a bad day on a fast court, you can lose to them. Interesting setup against Shapo. Normally I think Shapo was very vulnerable, but he played a full match against Fucsovics. Fucsovics sort of got frustrated early against Shapo. Shapo was more consistent than he usually is. It looked fresher. Also, he looked like he could hit the ball pretty big. Martin wasn't really hitting slices with his backhand at all. He was going over with the two-hander, which, it hits the ball faster, but I think there's less reason for Denis to miss with that shot. Fucsovics is mostly just driving it down the center of the court, unless he's well inside the baseline. So, I also think that he takes it. Fucsovics hit the ball down the line with his backhand frequently to try to, look for Denis's backhand, but it just was too telegraphed. Denis is not going to implode in a situation where, he doesn't feel a lot of pressure. He likes to hit the ball hard. He likes to rally. So that's what basically happened. And in the end, I think he's a better ball striker than Fucsovics. I expected Shapo to come in and make errors. Two guys in this tournament coming in who it felt like they just hadn't been doing anything, even though it was obvious they should get out of the slump eventually. It was Tsitsipas and Shapo, really. And, at a certain point in a slump, you just don't have much to lose. Everybody kind of expects you to lose, and it gets, I think, tough for the opponent to try to figure out what they should be doing. And, everyone's kind of expecting at this point Shapo to fall apart. And when he doesn't, he wins a 250 title at some random event, or he challenges in a big match. And this was a great win for him. 6-love in the third was very impressive. And, he'll be favored against Royer. I think Royer has better weapons to frustrate him. I think if Shapo gets into a server's battle, he tends to struggle because he can double fault in big moments, right? So you're applying pressure, it's scoreboard pressure, but the short points don't really give Shapo a good rhythm. The other times I think he can struggle is when his opponent doesn't really do much except block the ball back. I think, someone like Carballes Baena or Navone can frustrate him because they're just going to keep retrieving the ball and challenge him to escape rallies. And I think Denis can get a bit impatient there. Today he had sort of a game of fetch going on. Fucsovics was trying to hit the ball big to get through him, but a lot of the rallies turned into just forehand versus backhand. And Denis, traded well today, to his credit for that. Just a good day for him too on his forehand wing. He went to the open court well. I think he went inside out more than cross court, which seems to work well for him. So he should be slightly better than Royer here, but a harder match. I think I expect this one to go 4 or 5 sets. Simply because there won't be a ton of baseline rallies for Shapo to get comfortable in, and Royer serves way better than Fucsovics. So I like Shapo in 5 there. Very, very tricky opponent. Bublik, I think maybe 3 games in I turned this off because I just felt like Bublik, he had the look of someone who wanted to win. He's 0-3 against Cilic. He took all that time off. He didn't really disclose an injury or anything like that. He looked healthy. He looked fine. He looked like he's been training, and more than anything, he just looked committed. When they were trading from the baseline, the expression on Bublik's face and the level of focus he was showing was really impressive, and he was putting a little bit extra pace on every shot when he could. It wasn't just going for pure winners. He barely played a drop shot, early in the first set. He just outworked Cilic. He knew that he could, and to his credit, one of the best tee serves in the game, he really was able to hold on to every advantage that he got. So good plan for him. Kind of expect him to continue, and he'll have a good step up in level of opponent here against Skolkate. Tristan, played excellent against Sonego. Losing the third and fourth set 6-1, 6-1, you really don't expect somebody to come back. But I think what's happened a lot in Grand Slam tennis is when players go on a bad run and they have a slight lead in the scoreboard, a set or a break, they tend to just kind of, hang it up for that set. And, so you can discount the third, but the fourth, then it starts to look really bad. So, good fight for Skolkate. And he had good chances to close the fifth out, in Sonego's last service game. And he missed a few, he missed a volley at net that he probably should have put away to get a break point. He, missed a few shots at the end. I will say he got a bit lucky in the tiebreaker. There were, 4 or 5 points in a row where Sonego missed the line by an inch, and, Tristan hit the line on those. So, the 10-point tiebreak is really exciting at the end of a match, but it hurts to see people lose because it tends to just be, a lucky scramble or two that go your way, and you can see it on the players' faces too, that they just played, they just played 4 or 5 hours, to be out of there based off, a lucky light cord or a drop shot. Just rough, but a great match. I think the key for Bublik here is that his backhand is so solid. I think it'll be hard for Sonego's really taking a one-handed approach to this. It's serve and forehand. The backhand's not that good. I think it lets, Skolkate, not sure why I'm pronouncing his name like that either. Could be Skolkate. But, it lets him have a target, with Sonego's backhand, and I don't think that's there with Bublik. Bublik serves extremely well too, better than Sonego. Having the drop shot in his bag also with Tristan playing a 5-setter is important. Tristan, I do think he plays way better at the majors, which is a good tactic. He reminds me of a kind of a small version of Sinner. Early days. He has good balance, good movement, no real glaring weakness. Nothing is any better, I'd say, than anything else. Everything is just pretty darn good at this point. So I do expect him to get better, and his ability to win 5-set matches is a promising thing for his future. I think Bublik probably outlasts him. Should be a very close match, but I think I like Bublik in 4 sets there. He's just a bit more comprehensive, and I really like the way he played his first round. When he's motivated, he's in the top 20. When he's not motivated, he's in the bottom 20 of the top 100, so should be good. Borges and Paul should be a long match. I like Paul. He hasn't been that good this season, but Borges is a ball beater, and he tends to drag players that are worse than him. That's Brandon Holt. And I don't think he can do that with Tommy Paul. Just has the feel of a match where, one guy is a little bit better at scoring. Obviously, when you're out there and you're playing Nuno, it's not that easy, but it does feel like this is Tommy Paul's to lose. Decent showing against Moeller. Can't really take a lot from that result because Moeller's not really that good at hardcourt yet. A lot of errors. Not really. He doesn't really hit that big on the backhand yet. His results have really been like Challenger, Clay, where he dominated with his forehand and his, shot making and his depth of shot. And those things are kind of eliminated on hardcourt, because Tommy plays well and he defends well and he's fast, so just hard to score. So I like Tommy there. In 4 sets, he's not really been at his best, so I don't think it's in the cards for him to just win in straights. Musetti outlasts Perricard again. Perricard played well. Musetti just is able to put one extra ball back, I think, and a lot of players, can't do that. So it's a good matchup for him. Playing Goffin is very straightforward. Quentin Halise didn't play great. Goffin was able to, anytime he got a full swing to the open court, he really scored. And Halise still almost got back in the match. He was able to get the fourth set back from 4-1 and, almost close out. So, good for Goffin to get a win. I'm still not really happy with his level. I think Musetti beats him in 3 or 4. Just a situation where I don't think, the scoring opportunities against Halise were all just because he's not a quick lateral mover. And Musetti just eliminates that. He serves better than Goffin, has a bigger forehand. He's playing better. Just, I'm expecting a pretty dominant performance there. Brooksby Cabali should be really close. It's one I'd skip. I'd get tickets. I'm interested to see these games with the flat hitters against the topspin power players are really interesting because sometimes they just are completely harmless. I think Brooksby struggled against Khachanov with the same thing. You saw De Minaur struggle against Sinner. Medvedev against Alcaraz. Obviously those are top players. Anyone's going to struggle, but I think, Cabali's ability to generate without, taking big risks as far as location could be tough. Brooksby, 5 sets with Vukic is not that impressive, but, 5 sets with Passaro isn't either. I just put an asterisk near the matches where compatriots play each other because these players have played each other so often in training and they've seen each other play for years. They're very comfortable in the situation. There's no nerves or pressure because, it's a guy that, deep down you feel like I can beat him. The other junior from your club might be better. They might be winning all the titles, but, when you play them on a Tuesday, you feel like I could do this, and it lets you play freer. So I think that partially let Passaro play a little better. Cabali has a bigger serve than Brooksby. I do think Brooksby's ability to drag players will get him, a set or two. Just hasn't been, that automatic Brooksby that he was prior to his suspension. So I think it's hard for him to get across the finish line here without some help. So I like Cabali in 4 or 5 there. Diallo played really well. If you look at the scoreline and you think Djoumer is not a great hardcourt player, I don't know. If Djoumer plays Munar, I'm not really sure, Munar can win quickly at all. I think it would go 5 sets, and to Diallo's credit, he was driving the ball pretty consistently in that match. He played maybe 1 or 2 bad service games in the second to let Djoumer get back into it. But Diallo was up a break in the second also, so I think that was a real good performance from him. Has a bigger serve, obviously, than Munar. Munar has become really good on hardcourt at just dragging people, just not really giving them good opportunities to score and extending rallies. It's a good formula against Diallo because you're challenging his percentages. I think Diallo has the offense, though. I think, didn't play his best in the lead-up events, but, it's a Grand Slam. It's an environment that's good for him. I don't think Munar will have too much of the crowd. Should be pretty neutral, Spain and Canada. I was a little surprised at this one to see, even odds for this in some of the pricing. I guess Munar could outlast him. If Djoumer is right there, in overtime in 3 of the 4 sets, then you expect Munar to do a little better than that. Honestly, he's better on hardcourt as far as results. But I just think Djoumer has a big enough game to actually score on Munar, even when he's being very frustrating. If Jaume is able to, make it a backhand exchange and keep Diallo in that corner, it's going to be a long day, and he could win the match. I think this one goes 5. But I like Diallo's chances. I think he's, part of his mild slump coming into this means he's motivated, he's fresh, and I think Djoumer was the ideal warm-up match for him too. It's very similar to playing Munar, so I like him in 5. Bergs and Draper, I was looking at the Gomez match to see if he could wear Draper down. I don't think these guys lose their match fitness in a month or two. If they take a month off or something and they heal, I don't think they come back and just get exhausted. but it's something to look at, especially with Draper. He did look fatigued at times. He starts to shank the ball when he's tired. He'll take 2 steps to the side and really just send one, sideways cross court, and it looks awkward. You feel like he's ready to fall apart, but he doesn't, because when he has his feet planted, he's still a top 10 player. So, he was able to get past Gomez. Bergs is not really bringing the same level of offense. So this is a match where, I think Bergs only wins if Draper gets tired. And, in the first round, he finished strong. So, I think a match under his belt is useful. He's used to the courts now. He has a safe target in Bergs' backhand. Bergs doesn't really score with his backhand. His whole game is about getting a forehand, hitting to the open court, and coming to net. He applies a lot of pressure. Draper's pretty good at hitting passes, though. So, this should be as close, I think, as the Gomez match. But Gomez gets a lot of use out of his serve and forehand. It's an offense that I think Bergs is kind of lacking. So, should be a longer match time-wise. But I think similar result, Draper should win in 4. Zverev is in a tiebreaker right now with Tabilo, which makes me happy. Always nice to see him struggle. Tabilo played really well coming into this. I felt like that was a rough draw. I don't know if his backhand can hold up against Zverev. Even as Zverev plays passive, it's still like a very long match. So, assuming Zverev comes through, he should beat Fernley. RBA was down. He had a set point in the first set, fumbled it, and then immediately lost the set and lost the second. Down 4-1 in the third. Somehow came back and won the set. Fernley looked really tired, started sending the ball into the net. I think that is the concern there with him is he hasn't played a ton of matches this year. So, yeah, he's fresh coming into this, but, how many sets can he play? And rallying with Zverev, I don't think he can score. RBA was a little flat today to the wings. Fernley's best shot on both wings is going down the line. He hits his backhand and his forehand down the line more often than other players. Most players on tour are going cross court most of the time. And every time Fernley took the ball down the line and RBA had to stretch or lunge, he kind of just gave a setup or made an error. So just, he played the match fairly well, given he was having some, slight mobility issues, but it was a, kind of a safe space for Fernley. And I don't think that's there against Zverev, so I like Zverev there. Safiullin played phenomenal, I think, against Monfils. They traded sets until they got to the 5th. Safiullin got up a break, and then Monfils really locked in on defense. He just, he plays defense all the time, but down a break, he started to play the real defense, where he's hitting the ball hard and sliding and really not giving you any angles. So credit to Safiullin, still able to create. He was hitting his forehand really well today. Just stayed aggressive the whole time. Playing, 4 hours of offense against Monfils is not easy. So, I give him a pretty good chance against Auger-Aliassime. Felix, straight set win, right? But Billy Harris was as close to his own straight set win as you can really be and get straight setted. He was up a break a few times in the second. Really was able to break Felix's serve a few times when he needed to. And not doing anything crazy. I think Felix is still a bit impatient at times in rallies. Still very front foot offense minded. And, when it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. So, interesting situation here against a player who arguably is, a much more mobile player. Safiullin moves better, hits his forehand better, just does everything a lot better than Harris, but it's a similar challenge, I think. So, if I add a few games to Harris, add a few points on defense, suddenly the match looks pretty even. I do think Safiullin can actually win this, unless Felix steps his game up. And stepping his game up at a major, we've seen it a bunch of times. We've seen him go down a set or two, and just drag the player, based on stamina. just going to be hard here, even though Safiullin played 5 sets. It's going to be hard to mimic, the type of defense that Monfils played, especially when Monfils is a much more reliable ball striker. So I think the one question for me is Monfils hits the ball a lot flatter than Felix. Felix puts a bit more spin on it. And it gets the ball higher on his backhand also. So I think it'll be interesting to see right away, how Safiullin deals with that. Because he's getting full swings against Monfils, because Monfils is not really hitting with depth. He's just keeping the ball low and then defending. And Felix is putting the ball deeper and, using height and spin. So interesting challenge for Safiullin. I'll feel dumb if I say he's going to win. It's hard to point to underdogs as winning against a big name in form. But I don't think it's out of the question. I like Safiullin there to win in 4 or 5. Walton and Wong is great opportunity for both these players. Third round of a major is a huge check for Wong, and it still is for Walton, even though he's pretty established on tour. Wong, played great against Kovacevic, who showed up dressed like Ash Ketchum, which I support. But, it's a tricky thing. I'm sure his sponsors wanted him to, right? It's their design. It's a tricky thing on tour, I think, to wear, the cool outfit or the new or exciting thing. It's, I don't want to sound negative about it. I just think this happens in sports. You decide on an outfit to play, right? Let's say you're not sponsored. Let's say you're going to a tournament. You have a new cool shirt or something with a slogan or some kind of something else. Or, suddenly you're going to wear sunglasses for this tournament. And you get out there and you feel pretty cool. And you look pretty cool. And then you start losing. And suddenly your outfit starts to bother you. It's now I'm out here losing in this stupid shirt. Now you start thinking you look like a douche in your sunglasses or something like that. And, you see players struggle with that a little. I've seen, Osaka kind of regret a choice, after things went bad, kind of tugging at the jersey and wishing, maybe, you rocked something more subtle or comfortable. But, not a problem for Kovacevic here, just something that comes to mind. I'm not trying to single him out. I think Ash Ketchum's pretty cool. Pokemon are interesting. Pretty dangerous, if you ask me, from what I've seen. But, that's life. Life is danger. And I hope there's no spiders on me. But anyway, yeah, tennis. You guys probably want me to talk about tennis. Yeah, I think Wong slightly better. But here's the thing. Wong had a great run in qualifying. And a good win here, getting to the second round of a major. But Kovacevic is not really the best player. It's not really a huge win. And, I wrote off the win against Medvedev because I feel like Medvedev wasn't totally locked in and struggled with the heat a little bit. And I could say Humbert is still not at his best here, but, Walton just beat Medvedev and Humbert. So, beating Wong is not at all out of the question. Walton has been able to drag these players. He has a big serve. This is probably going to be a shootout. I think Wong has shown a better level so far. I think he's served really well throughout. I think he's hit his ground strokes with full conviction in every single moment. Whether it's a break point or match point, he just seems locked in this tournament. His energy is really good. The way he's moving around the court is tremendous. And he has a bunch of crowd support here. So I do think this will be very close. Walton's supposed to win, right? But it's sometimes easier to play as that underdog. And when you get in against a guy who's just grinding and you're supposed to win, suddenly you're trying to create all the offense. So I think I like Wong here. Just a really close match between two players. Boyer and Rublev. I thought Duckworth would drag Boyer, but just didn't happen. Boyer had more power, played solid. His early results that have been good have been on clay. So, this is a really big result for him and a bonus, to get these points and this money. Playing Rublev, not a disaster. Rublev has had some trouble in the past with players he doesn't know. He's not the best mover, so if your offense is brand new to him, he's not going to get to a lot of shots initially. I think Boyer will have a chance to score on him with his, just his weight of shot and his pace on his serve. Problem, I think, is it's a pretty straightforward approach. I think he also can get pretty frustrated out there, so Rublev battering away, if it starts to yield errors, I think Boyer might unravel a little bit. Rublev also just not dismantled, it was, 3-6-4 sets, but he beat Dino Prismic, and I think Prismic was bringing one of the best levels in from the qualifying draw. So, expect Rublev to play well again. Should win in 3 or 4. I think it might be 4. Boyer is playing well, and like I said, well, I'm not going to repeat myself. I just think, when you first play a player, if you're not the best mover, their offense, will have an effect on you. Khachanov, Majrzak should be pretty close. Majrzak had Delian wrapped up and then kind of fumbled the third set. Not a huge issue. I just don't think his game is huge enough to really shut down Khachanov. Basov already played a great match. It's a good warm-up to play against Majrzak. Majrzak does a lot of the same things. He takes the ball early, a lot of variety, very consistent, quick player. I just, it doesn't really, it's always doesn't really have the big weapons. Every match that he wins is going to include sets that are won by, a game or 2 at most. So I think he's in a bit of trouble against Khachanov, who's been playing decent this season. He's not really burnt out. The U.S. Open, a lot of guys who've played a ton of tennis are just kind of burnt, and Khachanov has kind of avoided that, even though he's having a pretty good season. So I like him to win in 4. I think they've had some close matches before. I will check if you give me 1 second. I guess you have to give me 1 second because you're listening. No, I'm wrong. It was Wimbledon where they played, and Khachanov beat him in straight sets. So, I think this is a better result here for Camille is incoming. A better result because he's a little better on hard court, but similar result. Khachanov probably wins in 4. Should be a lot of good baseline rallies here. I just think, one guy doesn't have to alter his game to score, and the other guy has to grind pretty hard. Rieti with a good win. This is, career-changing stuff for him to qualify and then get a win in a main draw. Playing Cerundolo, not really the best or worst situation. Cerundolo, as advertised, was not ready to play tennis early in this match against Arnaldi. He hit a bunch of forehands into the backdrop. Just very inconsistent on that side. Arnaldi probably wins this match most of the time. He was up 2 sets and 3-1 in the third, and from there, things just kind of got rough. Great win for Cerundolo. I think he should beat Rieti, honestly. If he starts off the same way, it's hard to really say, right? It's hard to say if he starts off the same rusty way. So was he working through rust early against Arnaldi, or is he not totally himself, and did he benefit from Arnaldi kind of losing the plot a bit as the match went on? Arnaldi hasn't really been great this season also. So, he's better on paper than Rieti, but Rieti is playing his best tennis right now. He's very sharp with his ball striking, so it's a bit more dangerous than Arnaldi. I think Cerundolo, if I had to guess, I think he'd win in a similar fashion if he won, by just kind of dragging him. Early on, Rieti's going to be very effective on serve. His forehand is pretty dangerous. But I think as things go on, he's not the most physically dominant player. I think physical fitness favors Cerundolo. Just because he has so much more experience in 5-setters. So I think he'll win in 5. if he blows him out, you move him into a different tier then. You say Cerundolo is probably going to give a tough match to whoever. But, I didn't see a lot that would indicate that against Arnaldi. Arnaldi was not playing his best, and he was still right there. Tsitsipas, Altmaier, great win for Altmaier. He really played great. 4 overtime sets and a 6-4 is a lot of work. He looked fresh at the end, though. Mijatovic played well. It's always exciting watching him play. He knows when to give up on a point. He knows when to grind for one. Just really a great tactician out there. I feel like he'd be a really, really good doubles player just because of his decision making. Just, not a match you want him to lose if you're looking for his career to keep progressing. He's starting to look like a guy who can win at the 2 out of 3 set level, but not really at the majors, based off this result and some in the past, some stamina issues in the past, some injury issues. So, I was having the same thought about Tsitsipas. I was thinking, I'm expecting him to make adjustments, to clean up the backhand, to work on the slice and these other things, but his results early in his career, the 5-setter with Djokovic at the French, making the finals, making the semis of a tournament, of a major or a Grand Slam in Australia, challenging for those big titles early in his career, he may have peaked. Team is out of the game already. And I think sometimes there's just a volume of top-level tennis that, a player can play. And once that period is kind of over, it's hard to get back. It's hard to, restart. It's hard to train. There's injury issues. Tsitsipas has had back issues. So good to see him winning, but I think I'm going to stop expecting something extra. I'm kind of looking at this now as sort of the second half of his career. So, I'll just try to enjoy watching him play. And I might, sometimes enjoy watching him lose. Muller just kind of started making a ton of errors in the, second and third set. He managed to get a small lead in the fourth, but Tsitsipas played decent throughout, so he's gonna win the match when he plays well. When he's shanking balls and making errors, he loses to the top guys. But the middle tier guys, he can still beat them playing 75% of his game. Altmaier is an interesting challenge for him. Very similar, both one-handers. Altmaier's is better, I think. His slice stays lower. More reliable with his shot making, I think. Also, he's not really worried about the technique. His game kind of looks high octane. It looks fatiguing, but he doesn't seem to get tired. The difference for Tsitsipas, the difference maker is going to be forehand and serve. He really hits his forehand much bigger, and he comes to net well after that, which is pretty good, I think, against a guy with Altmaier's forehand. It's not the most powerful. He does like to set up. He likes to play a bit deep in the court. So, really on Tsitsipas here to apply pressure. This could go either way. I think Altmaier is a big match player. 5 sets is a lot of work, but he seemed fresh. And, Muller kind of gave away the match in a sense by making all those errors. He really wasn't at his best. And he tends to just drag players. I think Altmaier has a bit more offense, a little more shot making. I think he could win another 5-setter. Tsitsipas wins a match, right? But similar to Cerundolo, I think he's still a bit vulnerable. Mochizuki with a good win. Him and Gaston had something like 20 breaks in their match, even though it was a straight setter. And I think that's the reason Mochizuki can't win this next round. Alex is going to apply a lot of pressure on his serve. And, you just can't afford to go down breaks against Alex because he just applies. I think he plays with more pace the larger his lead. I don't know if he realizes it or not, but it just feels like you give him the lead and it infuses energy in him. He beat O'Connell in straight sets. Mochizuki, I think, is better on offense than O'Connell, but similar lack of a serve that can hurt Alex. If Alex is putting every return in play, you're going to have a long day. I also think Mochizuki's best attribute is coming to net. He has great hands at net, But Alex is really fast, and that flat style of hitting and his short takeback make it tough to read his passes. So, I think he's gonna be able to win those duels often enough to win. In 3 or 4, a win of a set for Mochizuki here is a win, I think. He's a good player, just a bad matchup there. Djokovic, fool me once, shame, etc., etc. Djokovic has fooled me, 40, 50 times. He just comes in, he looks injured, he grabs at things, he winces, he looks tired, and then he wins comfortably. Lerner probably should have won the second set, had a set point, I think. But, if you look at the overall scoreline, Djokovic cooked him, and he just had, his best tennis maybe halfway through the match. Djokovic did look tired. He looked sweaty, but sweaty's not really a descriptor that can really tell you anything. A lot of players sweat. He looked uncomfortable. He looked grumpy, but yeah, Djokovic does that often. He's often complaining about things that aren't even clear to us. At home, he's complaining with his camp about something else, or the drink wasn't mixed quite perfectly, or certain biomechanical issues that he's not really sure were correct. And it doesn't actually have to be about his chances of losing the match. So, he's playing Svajda. I think Tien had a good chance to win a set against Djokovic. Just didn't have the weapons to do it. I think Djokovic was there for the taking, and Tien just didn't really have a way to take it. Svajda has some really good depth going right now. He serves a lot better than Tien. A little more offensive-minded, similarly talented mover and defender. But I don't really want to get fooled again. Djokovic is better at everything that I just listed. And I don't expect him to lose early in the tournament. This is a really good look, I think. The first look at whether the fatigue issue was a real thing or just him, not really pleased with his performance. So I think Svajda probably wins the set. If Djokovic plays a similar set that he played in the second against Svajda, I think Svajda will be able to, take the opportunity. He's hitting the ball really well. He's basically crushed everybody he played so far, and no pressure on him here. Although playing Djokovic for the first time at your home slam, you're gonna feel some. So Djokovic in 4 is what I expect there. Cam Norrie gets a nice forfeit. He's having a bad season, so that's a big result for him, I think. Korda played a week of tennis and decided that's good enough. Let's go chill. I'm sure that's not what he did. I'm sure these injury issues are difficult. It just feels like, he's become that, Dimitrov type player who's just often injured, rarely playing, even though, and when he is, you have high expectations because he is so good, but doesn't really seem like the most intense guy. Komisana, I didn't think he'd beat Mickelson. I said he's a big match player, but he hasn't played them this season in that manner. He played well there. I thought, from what I saw, he was just able to put returns in play. And if you're returning most of Mickelson's serves, Mickelson is going to feel pressure. He's going to go big, and that's going to cause errors. He really, can't produce that huge high-octane tennis for a really long match. He can do it for a set. I think that's why he's so good in the smaller hardcourt tournaments, because for one set, he can kind of serve well enough and hit big enough winners to apply pressure and make other people play smaller. But in a major, you have to play a ton of tennis. And, once he got down 2 sets, it felt like, he was under a lot of pressure in every service game. So good for Komisana. It's hard to see him hitting through Norrie, but I wouldn't rule it out. Norrie's still not into the territory where I really believe in him yet. I think, he's coming back from some injury issues. Hasn't really been 100% this season. Like I said, it's a good win for him, but it was a forfeit. So, yeah, I think he'll win. But, he's not 100% physically yet for me. I don't find him an automatic player at this juncture in his career. So should be interesting, but I still like Norrie. Tiafoe and Dam should be good. Darwin Blanche kind of didn't have a lot of variation on his serve. He just went big every single time. Should have been up a break in the second. There was a dispute about a line call. The ref overruled. Didn't really affect the match too much, but going from being up a break to back on serve is frustrating, and he got broken immediately after that. So just a long day for him, and I think Martin played more solid. I think Martin has a chance here to take a set off Tiafoe because he's playing so consistent. There's no hesitation about his shots at this point. He's serving well, going with a lot of body serves also, which is useful against Tiafoe. Does go with the slice return. He kind of chips it on his backhand if you go into his body, and it's good. It's good reaction, but tends to set up, I think. And for a lefty, the obvious target is Tiafoe's backhand. You don't really want to play his forehand. So interesting setup for Dam. I don't think he can win the match, but Tiafoe hasn't been really himself at times this season. It's just that the U.S. Open, you expect him to play well. Simple match against Nishioka. And, I think if he gets in trouble against Dam, he can always just elevate his game, So I like Tiafoe in 4. Struff and Rune probably lasts a long time. I haven't really felt comfortable with Struff, even though I expected him to win a handful of matches here. It just seems like he's always up against it, down a set and a break, and then he finds, you tune out, you come back, and he's, serving for the third set. It's like, oh, I guess you woke up. He has played Rune before, so he won't be completely confused. It was a clay court match, though, so it doesn't really matter too much here. Rune, got rid of Botic, Van de Zandschulp fairly comfortably considering his level last week. I think, for Rune, winning in straight sets is always a good sign. His main issue, I think, is, focus and return of serve. Or to put it in a better way, it's knowing how to play, what his game is supposed to look like, shot selection. It just, so it was good to see him, playing solid. He's a little shit, but that's life. Sometimes people are little shits. So he's working on it. I do think Holger has matured a lot over the last few seasons, which is good to see. There's a lot of guys who stay the same forever, but he's changing. He's working on his game, and I think the expectations are something that are kind of making it hard to see how good he already is. His results are excellent for his age. For his height also, he's not, a giant guy. So, it's just that he wants to challenge for majors, and early on people thought he might be in that, that Alcaraz Sinner class, and, he's really not there yet. So Struff is a tough out. It's a hard thing. I don't think Rune is that good of a returner, so, there should be some more close sets here. Played 2 tiebreakers with Botic, so I'm expecting something, very similar. And, I don't think Rune is the best at hitting passing shots, and Struff loves to get to net and apply pressure. So this is one where I think if Rune is being passive, he could be in a little bit of trouble here. Just something to look out on. I think he should still win. Struff makes a lot of errors with his backhand, and Rune is good at exposing, that backhand tactic. It's his one thing that he's really good at. So, well, I mean, he's great at tennis, but, that's the thing that I think you can reliably expect him to do. Mensik and Blanchet should be a close match. Blanchet, I thought he'd be competitive against Marozsan, had a chance, but it was pretty dominant. Marozsan didn't play poorly either. He hit his forehand real well. It's just it's a consistency and defense thing for him at this point. He's just not really... His offense is way better than his defense. So tricky for him to win unless he really plays lights out in the big moments. Mensik, some question marks around his fitness coming into this. Beat Jari, good win. Still question marks, I think, around his fitness. Blanchet's a tough out. He's gonna play well. I think Mensik is the same offense as Marozsan at least, but more consistent, and I think he's a better mover and a better defender. So Blanchet probably gets outlasted here in 4 sets. Should be high quality. I'll probably try to check out a lot of that to see, how Mensik is moving towards the end of the match. Fonseca Mashak is, another good one. Might be one of the best matches of the day as far as offense. Fonseca played really well, I thought, against Kecmanovic. Kecmanovic should have won 2 of the sets. He was up a few times, had some momentum, but just had a hard time, keeping rally ball errors out of his game. I guess some of that is from Fonseca hitting the ball so big. Just, it felt like an underperformance from Kecmanovic. Fonseca and Mashak, I don't think they've played before. Mashak has been physically questionable, same as Mensik. It's hard to say he's going to be completely fine. I do think he should win if he's okay. I think he has a good serve. I think he can trade with Fonseca. I think he's it's weird to say someone who might be injured or not 100% is physically stronger. But at this point, Fonseca really is, he's still not fully developed physically. He's not, totally durable. And that makes it tricky, against an older opponent. And Mashak can grind. He's very fast, while he's healthy. Really good mover, so he'll be able to put some extra balls in play. Good server. I think they're pretty equal on serving. Fonseca might be a slightly better returner at this point, but it's not automatic. I think he just is able to redirect the ball a bit better when he does, land returns. So I like Mashak in, 4 or 5 sets. There's no way it's going to be close for either of them. They both can hit the ball right past the other player, but I think Mashak is just a little bit better on defense and a little bit more experienced. And, I don't think Fonseca would have beaten Nardi 3-1-1. Nakashima Kim could be tricky. Jesper de Jong's a good player, but when you play 5 sets with him, it kind of leaves you open to, play 5 sets with anybody at that level. And I think Jerome Kim right now is a little bit above that. He beat Ethan Quinn, played excellent. Kim, since qualifying, there's been a lot of hype around his game for the last season, I'd say, on the challenger level, and he's kind of underperformed in big moments. So I just think it's very interesting to see him finally playing his best, because you wonder where the ceiling is now that he's finally, locked in. For sure, beating Quinn is a good win. Quinn is a tour level player. He competes well, and I caught a bunch of the 4th set, and Quinn was playing well. Kim was just a little bit more consistent, on offense. And I thought it was good that even in the big moments, he was still swinging big. Obviously, up 2-1, you're going to play pretty free. But, these are big moments for his career, and he played well. So I think, him and Nakashima has a potential to go 5 sets also. I don't think Kim could just cook him. Kim's offense is good enough that Nakashima's movement might be an issue here. But Nakashima's pretty steady from the baseline, and he serves very well. So there's a chance here that that neither player can really put the other person away. It's just going to be about who executes on offense better. That's probably Brandon. He has more experience. He'll definitely have the crowd. He's a crowd favorite here, and probably a little more durable. Physically, so I think I like Nakashima in 5. Lloyd Harris with a straightforward win. He's been working his way back towards the tour for a while, so a win at the majors is really important. He can certainly score on Fritz if he lands first serves. He's a good mover. This is a guy who won't be bothered by Fritz's level. He's physically capable of playing 4 or 5 hours of tennis with him. He has a big forehand to trade. Backhand, not so great, but he's a really good mover, which kind of can make up for pedestrian backhand. Harris is mostly just putting it in play. He slices a lot of backhands, but if you're moving well, it's hard to really create problems off of that. Fritz has a rock solid backhand at this point, but he's not really hitting winners with it unless the opportunity presents itself. So I think it'll be a long match, but obviously Fritz is better at this point. More experienced, similar serve. Maybe Fritz's is a little bit better. I think he's just a little bit more complete at this point, and really comfortable with the offense that he runs. So I think he wins that in 4. Shelton and Carreño Busta. Carreño Busta played pretty decent. Probably should have lost the first set against Lamas Ruiz, but good win for him. He's coming back from elbow surgery, so anything that happens that's good for him is good for him. I don't think he'll do that well against Shelton. Shelton's better from the baseline. He moves too well for Carreño to really outmaneuver him. And Shelton's serve is obviously tremendous, so should be a quick 3-0 for Shelton. Thompson Mannarino, tough match. Mannarino played really well against Griekspoor. Was kind of projected to win that also. Beat Tommy Paul, 2 weeks ago. The guy's playing excellent. Him and Thompson, I think, have played recently. He played him in Cincinnati, and he won in a lopsided 2 sets. So obviously Thompson gets better every week that he plays since his return, but Mannarino kind of has to start as the favorite here. I do think he'll win. He shouldn't be too tired from the Griekspoor match. That was 7-5, 6-4, 6-0. Thompson had a good win against Mute, but Mute's a little more frustratable than Mannarino. It's a different player, but it's also similar. It's a lefty. It's a short French guy. There's a lot of similarities in their approach and in their shot selection. So Thompson should be fine here. I think Mannarino can just squeak by in 4 or 5 sets. But, the upset is really not out of the question. I think if Thompson didn't have the long layoff, then this would be even odds. So Lehechka should beat Etcheverry. Coric was playing well, and Lehechka still got the job done. They've played 3 times before, but it was all clay court meetings, so not a ton of data there. They were close matches, but, you expect them to be on clay. I like Lehechka. He serves better. Etcheverry got a pretty lucky draw there playing Ugo Carabelli. If it was 3 years ago, Etcheverry would have a chance, but he hasn't really been that great lately, so... Collignon and Casper Ruud. Good win for Rafael in first round. Straight setting Galan is not that bad. Offner was, he's not really... He came back to the tour and he had some really good results, but he's not playing his best. Casper played well also. I think Casper will beat Collignon in 3 or 4 sets. Collignon has a great serve. Played really sharp against Galan. So, if this was a side tournament, a 250 or a 500, in the 2/3 structure, I think, he has a better chance against Ruud. But at a major, I think Ruud's just going to kind of grind him down. Bonzi and Giron. This one's pretty interesting because Bonzi had a right leg issue that he got treatment for against Medvedev, and he really wasn't moving well in the 4th, and really wasn't moving well in the 5th either. He just played hyper-aggressive tennis. Tremendous match, honestly, from him. Just to get through that, it feels like Medvedev, if they play that situation out 5 or 6 times, it feels like Medvedev wins the 5th set 5 times out of 6. Obviously, there was some controversy with the photographer coming on the court. I had to watch it a few times, honestly. Had to take a sip of water there. I'm sorry, because I'm about to give a hot take. But yeah, I don't. Okay, obviously you don't come on the court at that point. But when they told me the photographer came on the court, I thought they meant he like ran out on the actual court. He just jogged along the sidelines to the middle. And yet, I guess people don't do that. But also, it could have easily just been a who cares moment. You know, you can roll your eyes at the guy, or you can laugh at him, or you can ignore him. You can do any of them. But to act like that's a big deal, I don't really think it was. I'd say similarly, like I don't think in a vacuum the guy coming on the court should give someone a first serve. I don't know, that umpire Allensworth has had some issues before. It feels like he can freeze up a little in those big moments where he needs to take control. You know, and maybe he's a guy who likes to be patient. Maybe he's a guy who likes to hesitate and think things through before he acts. But it just feels like he can get a little flustered in those moments. And now the players know that, and they're sick of it. So, you know, Medvedev made a big deal out of it. It was a crazy scene, honestly. And, you know, the U.S. Open crowd at night, not the most tactful crowd. I saw a handful of situations this week that were, you know, a little bit disgusting. And, you know, one in particular was Iala playing Towson. You know, the crowd was whistling while Towson was trying to serve. You know, they were, you know, making noises, cheering for faults, cheering for errors. You know, every time Iala hit a shot that, you know, looked like it could be anything close to a winner, people were in the crowd were shouting. You know, just frustrating. They booed Towson for asking about a call, which was a legit call. Towson asked about a ball that Iala hit from right above the net. And you're allowed to video review that to see if the racket made contact, you know, across the net or not. You know, you have to wait till the ball crosses the net fully to make contact. And, yeah, I don't know, the crowd booed. So just a rough situation. And I get that Medvedev riled them up. You know, he said afterward he wasn't thinking about it too much. He didn't feel like he was doing that. He knew he was going to get fined for what he said about, you know, Opelka to the camera. He took credit for kind of driving the situation, and he said that, you know, he just didn't feel like it should have been a first serve. Obviously, once the crowd makes noise for forever, you get a first serve, you know. But it just felt like the initial camera guy faux pas was just like, you know, haha, that's embarrassing for him, but, you know, get him out of there and continue play, you know. But Medvedev did say that he never expected to actually get back in the match. You know, he said that basically he, you know, it was, you know, if it was first serve or second serve at match point there, he had played a rough match. The guy was beating him. The guy was playing well, and he thought he would just lose anyway. So he said basically once he got back into it, he realized, you know, he had some momentum, but, you know, all in all, he was doing it thinking, basically, I'm on my way out of here. I'm going to have some fun. So just a interesting situation, you know, and I think Bonzi, if he's healthy, he's much better than Garon at this point. Garon, you know, should have won in straight sets against Navone. Good for him to reverse that result. He did play well. You know, these courts are good for him. He's hitting the ball well. Not serving the best. You know, if his leg is fine, you know, if it was a fatigue issue, he should win this match. But if he's having, you know, the same issues he had against Medvedev, I think he's going to have a hard time dealing with Garon's offense. And Garon, is really fast. So it's going to be tricky for Bonzi to score, you know, as the match goes on. So I do think Bonzi's good enough that if he takes the court, he's going to win sets. I just think Garon is going to outlast him. I think he'll win in 5. It's purely based off the leg issue. But Bonzi was really not moving well at the end of that match. He was basically, you know, going for broke, guessing on serves, and anytime he had to run, you know, 2 sprints side to side, he was pretty much just slicing the ball back and hoping. You know, Medvedev really did just fumble. He was up, you know, a break twice in the 5th. So, interesting spot. Great win too, honestly, for Bonzi to close that out. It felt like he deserved it. It would have been pretty crushing for him to lose, from where he was in the match, and for him to come back and win, while not moving well, while injured, took a lot of heart. Rinderknech Davidovich should be pretty good. Fokina played exceptional in the first round. I think Shevchenko's not really a dominant player here. Him losing to Davidovich is not surprising. But, there were question marks about Davidovich's health after withdrawal. So, no more question marks. I think he is good enough in the rally that, he can maneuver Rinderknech into errors. I don't think Fokina needs to red line either. I think he can hit the ball clean, just kind of move it around and, get the errors. I think Rinderknech is going to feel a little bit trapped in the match. And after he had 4 sets with Carballes Baena, who is basically just 1/3 of Fokina's game, it's just the defensive aspect of Fokina's game. I think, it's going to be hard for Rinderknech to turn around here and pull a big upset. So I like Davidovich in 4 sets. Hard to blank Rinderknech because he serves so well, and he is a pretty smart player. He gets to net a lot, but Fokina looks solid. Dartari and Spizzirri should be a long match. Spizzirri really outlasts his opponents. That's his main thing. He's very solid from the baseline. He's going to drag you out. He's going to play forever. He'll play 6 hours of tennis. Conveniently, that's Dartari's game also. I think Dartari serves a little bit bigger. So this is a spot where I think it'll be close throughout. I think there'll be a lot of breaks. I think there'll be a lot of changes in momentum, some close sets. For me, Dartari's a little bit better on serve. I think he has a little bit, he plays defensive, but I think he had a good week last week. And he served well in what I saw in the first round. So I think he should win that in 4. Spizzirri is a somewhat unknown commodity. He's had some good wins, but I think they're all at slightly lower levels than the tour. So I like Dartari. Oh, the last match. Excellent. Bellucci with a good win. Shang's not really back to tour level yet. Coming back from injury, an ankle surgery. So good win for Bellucci. Good to see Shang sort of playing some tennis again. Sure, he'll be back to, good form by next season. Bellucci, Alcaraz, not really expecting a lot there. Bellucci being lefty makes me want to comment on some things. For a while I had said that Alcaraz had a little bit of trouble with lefties, or that lefties could fare just a slight bit better against him, than other players if they were lower level. But I think that's gone now. His backhand has made great improvements. I think also he has the experience now in playing against the tour level lefties to kind of navigate it a bit better, to know. You can see it when he plays Shelton. When he gets in any sort of trouble, he just isolates the backhand. He keeps the ball high there, and he starts to just hit, forehands with heavy topspin there. And it's hard for the players to create from there. And, he also can vary. He can add in drop shots in there. He can, the guy's good. The guy's excellent. And I hope he makes a deep run at this tournament, because there's some decent prize money. And you can actually use some of your prize money to hire a barber, because you have millions of dollars. Why is your brother cutting your hair? But yeah, I guess who cares? Let your brother cut your hair. It doesn't look bad, Tiafoe didn't love it, which is good. I feel like you need that. You need some guys on tour who aren't just going to say the very media trained response. You need some friends to roast you and joke around with. If I get a bad haircut, my friends are going to look at me and crack jokes and, Photoshop me onto a giraffe and all kinds of special stuff. So, good for Alcaraz. He looks a bit like a warrior, I do feel like players tend to play better. This is a bit, it'll sound superstitious, but I feel like players play really sharp when they've just gotten a haircut. It's just kind of, it's like a comfort and confidence thing, I think, for a lot of people. So, I think he'll win here. I watched him play a bit of the Opelka match. It wasn't very great tennis. Opelka can miss the ball at any moment, and it kind of makes it hard to watch. There's no rhythm to it. And you kind of know he's just not going to win. He only lost by a break each set, but, not the best. I don't think Bellucci serves as well as Opelka. Plays more consistent, but, this is a match where I think Alcaraz will play himself into shape. And somehow I thought this was going to be like 20 minutes, but it's an hour and 10 minutes. And I'm sorry. And if you're a Spider and you're listening to this, I will exit your closet soon, sir. Please do not attack. All right, bye. That was a weird ending.